So, books that have made me cry. This is weirdly something that a lot of people have asked about. And it's really fascinating to me that you're also invested in documenting my suffering. But you all know I love you for that. So as I was going through my bookshelves trying to pick out the titles that I was going to talk about for this topic, I was realizing it's kind of strange, unusual set of books that you wouldn't normally see together, and as I was picking them out, I was also reflecting on what are the things in fiction or in literature in general that make me cry. What are my emotional reactions to things like, do I place a lot of worth in emotional reactions like that? Do they sort of up the experience of reading for me? And I came up with some answers and made some good reflections on my reading, I guess. So the first thing I would say is that with the exception of maybe 2 or 3 in this pile, I wouldn't necessarily call these my favorites. It's not like I'm picking out all of these based on how much I love them because they made me cry, or I don't really invest that much worth in did a book make me cry or not when it comes to deciding how much it impacted me or how much of a favorite it is. I usually don't feel like, oh, this book made me cry, so that's an instant 5 stars. It's more like, this book made me cry, but there are other aspects about it that I could criticize, and it's not, not everything hinges on did it make me cry or not. And while I will say that some of these titles did make me cry for really emotionally important reasons, and I think deeply personal reasons that add a lot of worth to the impact of the novel or the work at hand. While there are some titles like that in here, some of these other ones, they made me cry just for more cliche, conventional, almost dipping into corny reasons. Corny, romantic, sentimental stuff does get to me, people. And I don't know if I should be revealing that information online, but it's true. So there will be some of that, but there will also, I think, be some other discussions about the titles themselves and how deeply emotional, important they are. And another thing that I should say is that as I'm going to be going through these titles and discussing them, the discussions on them are not going to be too in-depth. It's not going to be an overall, an overview of the work and going into the details of the themes and important, impactful historical context or anything like that. It's just going to be more maybe general plot summation, but also mostly talking about the aspect of the book that made me emotional or made me a little misty-eyed or whatever. So it's going to be more about that. I think that's evident given the title, but just to make sure, it's not going to be too many comments on the book's overall worth and impact itself. So I'm going to be going through these on alphabetical order by author's last name. I'll tell you what about them made me cry, and you will see just how bizarre of an experience this is going to be. I can just tell just by looking at the spines. All right, so we're gonna start right off the bat. We're gonna start weird. We're gonna start unusual. We're gonna start with The Exorcist by William Peter Blatty. Now I know this will probably be the one that'll cause laughter and ridicule the most, but I'll tell you right off the bat, if you're someone who cannot conceive of any deep emotional impact coming from a work of horror fiction or transgressive fiction or anything off-putting and abhorrent like that, I'll just tell you this channel's probably not for you, because I feel like that's just the entirety of the discussions on here, looking for worth in things that you would otherwise not expect. So yeah, just letting you know. But yes, The Exorcist by William Peter Blatty. It's a story that I feel most Americans know. I do think it's one of the great American novels in my opinion. So influential in the development of the horror genre in the decades that followed it, and everybody knows the story. The film adaptation is just as, if not, some would argue, even more famous and impactful than the novel. But William Peter Blatty did write the script for that as well. The Exorcist, a story of demonic possession in which this little girl, Regan, sees herself in the clutches of this demonic entity known as Pazuzu, and it is up to this concerned mother and this local priest who with a dwindling fate to join hands and use celestial intervention in order to save this little girl. So I do think that those who have seen it and are like-minded like me, and they know of the possibility of emotional impact in a work like this, I think those people and will agree that this is a deeply tragic, meditative, and really, really sentimental, bleak, depressing novel. It really is. And the emotional impact behind it, I think, is due to the players that are moving within the story. I think that William Peter Blatty did a phenomenal job in picking out just these deeply broken souls to sort of explore the grief and the chasms in their heart, and it's just so humanistic the way that he approaches it, and it's a work of dark fantasy slash demonic horror fiction thematics are going on in here, right? But William Peter Blatty never abandons the humanity of his characters. You have this mother struggling with divorce, struggling with being a single mother, struggling with raising her child, and confusing at first the demonic possession for emotional acting out due to her parents' divorce or due to neglect, things like that, confusing it, consulting psychologists, and all of that journey to trying to achieve emotional healing, where emotional healing is going to do nothing because it's actually a demon. That journey is so harrowing, so wounding, so painful to witness. And in the film adaptation, I gotta give a shout out. In the film adaptation, I feel like it's equally visceral, and Ellen Burstyn's performance as Regan's mother, incredible. And then you have Father Karras, who is struggling with his own dying ill mother, his own questions and holes in his faith, coming to a confrontation with all of these deep introspective questions when it comes to the fact that he's the only hope that this mother has in saving her young daughter. So it's just broken, wounded people trying to help each other and trying to clamor to God and trying to get God to intervene. But how do you do that when you're so emotionally broken? And brilliant stuff. I tell you, this is brilliant. Okay, I know some of you get really snooty and you get really elitist about literature, but read The Exorcist, for fuck's sake. And then now the next title is another unusual one, not in the title itself, but in the reason that it made me cry. So this is The Master and Margarita by Mikhail Bulgakov. And I made a video, but it was a Patreon exclusive video, I believe. But it was a video that I made on the works of fiction that have impacted me the most throughout my life. And this was one of them. So I read this back in 2019. Not going to go too much into detail as to my personal life, but I was going through a lot. I was working a job that I hated, blah blah blah, all the things that we all go through. And I had fallen out of love with my love of reading, because I had previously done this little stint at grad school that didn't work out. I ended up withdrawing from my PhD program and having to find a job and all that. So I hadn't read a book in months, perhaps even a whole year by the time that I picked this up. And this is a story about, it's essentially about these two lovers who have been separated, the lovers in the title, and these two trying to reunite, and it's the journey that each of them go through in order to sort of be in each other's embrace again. But they are doing this in the midst of the devil, Satan himself, descending upon Russia and wreaking havoc. And of course, Satan and his pawns, one of them being this giant black cat named Behemoth, they intervene in the lover's journey. And it's full of whimsy, it's full of magic, it's full of like magic realism and fantasy and things like that. But there's a particular moment in this novel where Margarita, who's been imprisoned somewhere, I can't recall the details exactly, but she escapes by means of magic. And these means of magic involve a flying broomstick. So she escapes by witchery and allusions to her being a witch and things like that. But the moment of like this liberating feeling of her finally escaping and finally being on her way to her journey towards happiness and love and all of this. As I was reading that, feeling absolutely imprisoned in the then current circumstances of my life, and reading this story of like full of whimsy and magic and liberation and joy and the pining for joy, and the societal intervention, societal turmoil, such as is represented by the arrival of Satan, all of that intervening in that journey, but still finding those moments of joy and liberation. And reading about that, I'm even getting a little bit of like goosebumps right now. But reading about that, being in a moment of feeling just so drained, being so weighed down, really just reignited, in an almost literal sense. I could feel the reignition of that flame in me, reignited my love for reading, my love for literature, and that I think was a pivotal moment that led to my decision to doing this whole channel where I discuss books and things like that, because this really impacted me, and I shed tears over that. But the initial reason why I said this was another unusual title to discuss in a video like this is because those were tears of joy. They were tears of, well, maybe there was a little bit of sadness and regret in there, but I think it was mostly a feeling of that reignited passion, and shedding these tears of joy of being. It almost felt like being reacquainted with an old friend. I told you this video was going to get cheesy. And then moving on, now we have a title in the non-fiction category. This is Black Skin, White Mask by Frantz Fanon. And I guess this would be another unusual title for this kind. And when I keep saying unusual because I feel like when you click on a video like this, you're expecting like, I don't know, a little life or some kind of tragic story written by a straight person where a gay guy dies. But you're not really gonna get that here. But yeah, Black Skin, White Mask by Frantz Fanon. It's a work of nonfiction. I think one of the initial works of post-colonial theory that tackled the subject of psychoanalysis and how psychoanalysis figures prominently in the subject of race. So I read this in my senior year in college when I was doing my undergrad. I majored in English. Surprise. And I picked this one up because I was working on my then honors thesis for my senior year. And I was reading through it, hoping to glean something, because I was working on a project about horror and the influence of horror into race and the unconscious, and using and a psychoanalytic approach, race-based readings on horror films specifically. Anyway, I'm not going to bore you with all that jargon, but I picked this one up because this, like I said, tackles psychoanalysis and race. And the reason that it made me cry was because there was a moment of really deep, impactful recognition when it came to a passage. Fanon is talking. It's a autobiographical vignette where he talks about this instance where he boarded a train because he was a black man living in France at the time. He boarded a train, and he was, I believe, the only black person in that train. And across from him were sitting a white mother and her white child, and the white child kept staring at Fanon, and then kept turning to his mother and saying, Mom, the Negro is going to eat me. The Negro is going to eat me. I'm scared, Mom. And sort of then Fanon moves into this really, really visceral, really harrowing passage where he describes this feeling of the undoing of his skin, because the title Black Skin, White Masks refers to this moment of putting on a veneer of something palatable for the white sort of surroundings that one finds themselves in as an outsider, as a marginalized individual. So one sort of grows to feel confident in that white veneer, that veneer of white propriety. And it starts to feel like one's, actual skin, even though the actual black skin or brown skin is underneath. And in this moment where he sees himself so deeply wounded by the words of this child, Fanon describes this a beautiful, almost ethereal, but like I said, really disconcerting and harrowing passage of the undoing of his skin, of it peeling off. And feeling vulnerability once more, feeling absolutely naked and at the clutches of this racial hostility. And reading that just absolutely broke me. Not only because, as a brown person, there are similarities in our experiences of people as people of color, as there are as the experiences with black people around the world. It's absolutely not the same by any means, but there are similarities, and in those similarities, I think there is that recognition of the deep wound that whiteness enacts upon us, that is so skin based, that is so color based, and it does feel like this undoing of flesh, like this absolute refusal of your own humanity. And wow, it's just so like, fuck, read this book. And once more, I think it's going to be the latter half that has the sort of more conventional reasoning behind my crying, but yet again we have a kind of an unusual one. But the story itself does have taste. It does have tragedy in it, death, bleakness, those awesome things. But I think that the reason behind why it made me cry is also unusual, but it's The Sound and the Fury by William Faulkner. Now this is of course the legendary story of the Compson family, the Compson children in particular. It's divided into sections, each narrated by one of the Compson children, and then the final section narrated by their black caregiver and her perspective on it, basically saying these white people are stanky and stuff like that. But yeah, The Sound and the Fury, like I said, does have tragedy in it, plenty of it. It's a really bleak Southern Gothic at its best, masterpiece, all that shit. But it made me cry out of frustration because this was a assigned reading in college, and I have to preface this by saying I love this novel. It's one of my favorites. I adore it. It's incredible. It made me fall in love with American literature in a way that I never thought I would. Love it. Love Faulkner. It made me cry out of frustration because I couldn't fucking understand what was going on. In fact, I even own a Norton annotated critical edition of it. I own 2 copies of it. I think it's one of the few books that I own 2 copies of that is not for collecting purposes. Because if any of you have given it a try, and it's written in a stream of consciousness style, it's a very modernist novel and very fragmented, very reflective of fragmented thought when it came to identity, when it came to familial bonds, all of these things that are so deeply ensnared into the culture of the South, of the American South. But it's very, very difficult to understand without guides. And it was assigned reading. I had to write a paper on it. I was frustrated. I was angry. I had a bit of a mental breakdown reading this. I think it's one of the few books that has given me a mental breakdown. So that involved crying. So I think it belongs in this. But I think the experience of that ultimately very rewarding. I recognize the genius in this, but I don't suggest that anybody put themselves through that when it comes to reading a book. And now we're moving on to, okay, I think this is the most recent book I've read that has made me cry. And I did talk about it recently on a video that I made, but Herculin Barbin, which is let me get the actual wording correct. Herculin Barbin, being the recently discovered memoirs of a 19th century French hermaphrodite, introduced by Michel Foucault, translated by Richard McDougall. Yes, these are the recently discovered memoirs of a 19th century French hermaphrodite. So it's about a real life 19th century French hermaphrodite. Of course, hermaphrodite being an outdated term. Now we would refer to people with this kind of genitalia as intersex people. But at the time, that was the terminology. That is how Herculin Barbin came to be identified. And Herculin Barbin is also, I think it's something that Foucault doesn't really focus on, but I do kind of want to focus on it a little bit. It is unknown ultimately what their identity would be. I'm more inclined to refer to Herculin Barbin as she. They were initially identified as female, and then were torn from their existence as female and forced to lead a life as male. But Herculin Barbin always ultimately rejected that imposition of you have to live your life as male now, and it ultimately led to suicide, which was deeply, deeply, deeply tragic. And just thinking about it is getting me a little emotional, but I'm fine. But yeah, it's just such a sincere, brief and simplistic anecdote straight from the mind of Herculin Barbin. And just the simplicity of it, it's not really concerned with documenting anything like gender theory. Of course, it's not really concerned with reflecting on any kind of model of gender theory that didn't exist at the time that Herculin Barbin was alive, of course, or reflecting on that position within the gender binary or things like that. It's just more the final word, the parting words, almost verging on that tragic tone of a suicide note. Just the tragic final reflective moments of somebody recognizing that they've been torn from comfort, stability, from the meaningfulness behind identity forever, and they've decided to take their life. And man, it's so important. I think one of the very few narratives concerning the intersex experience that I've ever read or even heard of. So yeah, it's great. It's fantastic. All right, we're moving on to another demonic possession horror novel, Come Closer by Sarah Grant. Am I starting to notice that maybe I have a soft spot for demonic possession? Maybe. Very, very similar reasons. Well, very similar story, first of all, to The Exorcist. Like I told you, these are not the greatest works of fiction ever penned or anything like that. It's just, it's more conventional, but I would call this, and I have called this, a phenomenal novel before. This is the story of a woman who starts to feel inner emotional changes take place in her life, in her behavior, how she carries herself in her relationship, in her workplace. Little by little, it starts snowballing into bigger and bigger, more bizarre changes with bigger consequences behind them. And ultimately, she consults the side of those who involve themselves in studying the paranormal or combating the demonic. And she comes to the realization that she is in the grips of a demonic possession by this, interestingly in this moment, female demon who has fallen in love with her and refuses to let her go. So yeah, I mean, if just from the brutality of that premise alone, you can see. But there is something that Sarah Grant does that compels me to call her a phenomenal writer. She really is. And that she really, really masterfully places you in the midst of that emotional coming undone. Like you really feel the fabric of this woman's life unstitching strand by strand, and it makes you feel the pricking and of that undoing thoroughly. And you really feel despair setting in more and more. You really feel hopes dwindling more and more. And just the entirety of that trajectory, even though it's conventional, like I said, even though it is kind of in that schlocky horror stuff, like almost kind of throwaway premise of horror, ultimately the emotional experience that I went through reading this led me to the final moments. Not gonna spoil what happens, but holy fuck, I was in tears. It was incredible. It was great. It was a great experience. I think also I also read this in the early days. I had already started my channel, but it was in the early days of it. So again, more fuel for me to just go. Books are fucking amazing. Now this one I read in college as well. This is Arthur Miller's Death of a Salesman. I think most people actually read this in high school, maybe even middle school. Elementary? No, I don't think so. I don't think elementary, but I didn't read this until college because my K through 12 education was not the best, but it wasn't the worst. But we didn't read Death of a Salesman, and I will forever be resentful of that. But this is the story of a salesman who is basically on the last kicks of his profession, a door-to-door salesman who is seeing infrastructure entirely mutated, who is seeing social interactions entirely mutated, who is seeing social and economic hierarchies entirely mutated, who's seeing the entire humdrum and pace of life entirely mutated from the glory days of the heyday of him being a salesman. He's going through economic struggles, he's going through familial struggles, identity struggles in his place as the man of the house, and raising his children right, his sons, and what their place is going to be as men in this new and evolving world, his relationship with his wife, all of this in this. It's a play, by the way. I didn't even fucking say it's a play. Penguin Plays. It's a play. All of it, but it's in the form of dialogue and interaction and dramatics. It's in that, right? It's all told through the very words of the characters, and the dialogue is just so. It's not overly sentimental, but it is just infused, drenched, dripping with emotion nonetheless. In what is left unsaid, I think in the empty spaces of this play, it is where just as much affect and grief linger, just as much as in the actual dialogue, in the actual space that it takes place in. Those who have read, it's a very, very famous story, but I'm still not going to spoil anything. But those of you who are familiar with it, you know what I'm talking about. It's great. And this next one, well, I was going to talk about, this man has written 2 books. Both of them have made me cry, but I'm going to talk about, I've talked about his other one, Pedro Páramo, already. I haven't talked about this one that much. El Llano en Llamas, or I've seen it translated as The Burning Plain, or the Plain in Flames. But this is his short story collection. Juan Rulfo, the greatest Mexican author, in my opinion. In many people's opinions, actually. He wrote this short story collection, and he wrote his other novel, Pedro Páramo. I think the novel is even shorter than the collection. So wrote 2 very slim tomes, well, can't call them tomes, volumes, books, and then that's all. And still they've been enough to impact and entirely change the panorama of Latin American literature forever. So yeah, he was kind of a big fucking deal. Anyway, enough of praising him, but I just can't help it whenever he comes into the conversation. But there's a story in here called No oyes ladrar los perros, and that is, I've seen it translated as Can't you hear the dogs barking, or No dogs bark. I would translate it as Do you hear the dogs barking? And it's a story of a man whose wife has passed away, and he is left with his son to take care of. But his son is already an adult man, and his son is a giant fuck up. His son is a drinker. He's had various altercations with the community. He's had various problems with the law. He's just been the absolute worst, and he's always returned to his parents for help, and his parents have always ended up helping him. And the stress of that, the father in the story even condemns him as, I feel like the stress of that was also what led to your mother's death, but we don't really know if that's true or just an impassioned accusation. But anyway, as the story goes on, basically in the story, the father, this elderly father, is carrying his adult son on his back because he is carrying him to, hoping to find a nearby town where there's a doctor because he is ill, and because the mother's final wishes were that the father keep taking care of their son. There's a lot of resentment. There's a lot of even deep familial hatred, which is, I think, the most intense kind of hatred in their interactions. And the title of the story comes from the fact that because he has his son raised higher than him, because he's carrying him on his shoulders, I believe. He's sort of like, his son is sort of hunched over him, and he says, well, we're traveling and we have to cross this hill, but you have a better, grasp of the sound up there. So let me know. I'm going to walk in this direction, and you let me know if you hear dogs barking, because that's going to mean that the nearby town is there. And as they're walking, and the father is reflecting on all of this, deep emotional turmoil that his family has gone through, how much he might actually hate his son, how much he might actually just not even want to help him if it weren't for his wife's final wishes. And he keeps asking him, like, do you hear the dogs barking? Do you hear the dogs barking? He gets no response. He's like, you're so useless. You can't help me. I'm so tired. It's, my God, when I tell you, I saw a lot of my family in that story. I saw a lot of my culture in that story. I saw a lot of my home region in that story. Just so fantastic. And I think I don't even want to go into like analytic form and try to tell you what about that deeply impacted me, or what the significance of it is. I think just by giving you that plot summation, I think Rulfo and his own words and his own premises and his own ideas are enough, and they speak for themselves. All right, now moving on to Ceremony by Leslie Marmon Silko. I read this one in college. So Ceremony is a Native American novel. It is about a war veteran who's returning to his reservation, and about the deep psychic wounds that he has suffered. I believe he was imprisoned by Japanese enemies. He's going through a lot of, obviously, PTSD, a lot of emotional turmoil, a lot of cultural turmoil in his own identity as a mixed race Native person, and sort of the journey through the ceremonies of healing that his culture provides. And in going through those ceremonies and traditions, sort of reflecting on his own identity and reflecting on his own beliefs. Does he really believe in the power behind these ceremonies anymore? Is fate and sort of like a native outlook on life, is that dwindling, dying away? Because a lot of these narratives are always written sort of at the verge of that cliff, in that plunge into oblivion. It's something where you feel that pressure behind dying traditions and dying cultures, but you also feel the deep strength and resilience behind the people that are still passing these stories along. And as somebody myself who struggles with PTSD, and at the time that I read this in college, I think is when it was at its most acute, and reading about this journey of healing, while also being in a place of academia as I was then, where you go through a lot of deep reflection yourself when it comes to your identity as well. I feel, especially if you're a person of color, when you're in college, because that's where you become much more exposed to other identities, or those who share the identity with you. You become more exposed to the history and the literature behind it. And so I was going through a lot of that while simultaneously dealing with this deep emotional disorder that I was struggling with and still struggle with. But reading a book like this really helped me sort of map out where these struggles sort of intersect, but also where the divide is, and what healing through one can mean for healing for the other, and etc. So just this very, very deep emotional connection that I experienced with this novel and the journey of the main character. Like I said, even though these identities are not the same at all, my experience is not the same at all as somebody from Native ancestry who lived in the 1970s, etc. But still, the resonance is there, and I think resonance, this video has proven, is enough to get the waterworks going. And then finally, the last book that I'm going to talk about here on this video is Mrs. Dalloway by Virginia Woolf, another book that I read in college. Now I'm starting to think, because I've said a lot of these I read in college, so maybe it was just the horrific stress of college that had me emotional. And that might not even be a joke. There might actually be some truth to that. But anyway, Mrs. Dalloway by Virginia Woolf. This is a story about a wealthy British woman who goes out into the street to buy flowers because she's throwing a party. It's Mrs. Dalloway. And that's it. That's the plot. that pretty much covers it all. But of course, it's not just that. There's more to it. It's about the unraveling of the human experience in something as mundane as going to pick up some flowers. And that is the first line of the book. Mrs. Dalloway said she would buy the flowers herself. And then we go off into the streets of London. We see the leaden circles of Big Ben banging and dissolving into the air. We see the passage of time, the regression of time, in the process of memory and recollection, the introspective journey of Mrs. Dalloway, calling back to her youth, but also just reflecting on her current state, but how her current state folds into her experience of the past, folds into her hopefulness or hopelessness of the future. All of that interjecting with the passage of time, being symbolized by Big Ben, announcing the hours in the sky as the hustle and bustle of the city comes into full life, and she sees before her eyes all of these people dealing with their own internal journeys, that wondering where did their time as in their youth intersect with her time in her youth. All of this, it's a cacophony of existence laid on the page. It's why it's one of my favorite novels. I think it's one of the most genius explorations of humanity. And in particular, again, with the PTSD, there is a character here who's suffering from combat shock after a World War I veteran, who we get his experience because his path crosses Mrs. Dalloway's path when they both sort of are nearby on the street somewhere, and then we follow his journey of just deep instability and chaos and aimlessness, and his struggles with his wife, his really young wife who just doesn't know what to do or how to help her husband, this pining for peace and tranquility, and how it resonates with Mrs. Dalloway's own pining for peace and tranquility, but in just such opposite, experiences. Somebody who's given their life, somebody who's giving their peaceful state of mind, sacrifice that for the war, and somebody who's so disconnected, Mrs. Dalloway, a high society person, so disconnected from that experience, a woman, somebody who wouldn't go to war in the first place at that time. But how in the sparks that they throw off in their own emotional experience, there's a little rubbing of those sparks here and there, and that resonance is the deep introspective look into the human experience of how consciousness works and how it connects us, that becomes emblematic of what modernist literature is. Beautiful novel, beautiful literature. This is beautiful. I think that is the most beautiful pile of books that I've ever talked about on this channel. But yes, those are the books that have made me cry. Those are the books that have made me just shed tears at the appalling beauty of literature, the appalling beauty of human voices of all sorts, the appalling nature of what grief is, what really intense emotional experiences, all of that. So you go ahead and let me know in the comments, what books have made you cry, for what reasons. Don't be afraid to get cheesy. Don't be afraid to get corny. If a children's book made you cry, that is perfectly valid. If a cheap romance paperback you picked up made you cry, that is perfectly valid. Just let me know about it. All right. So I hope you're all well. Continue to stay safe. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I will see you on the next one. Peace.